Jake is the only character in Adventure Time who already knows how to live. Finn spends 10 seasons searching for purpose. Simon spends 1,000 years trying to recover himself. Marceline struggles with loneliness, Princess Bubblegum struggles with control, and almost every major character in the show is trying to become someone they are not yet. Jake is different. Somehow, quietly, almost accidentally, the funny, stretchy dog standing next to the hero has already arrived at an answer the rest of the series keeps circling around. Once you notice it, it becomes strangely difficult to unsee. Most stories treat the sidekick as a mirror that reflects the hero back at himself. The sidekick carries the bags, asks the questions, reacts to the danger, and gives the audience someone easy to stand beside. Jake was never really doing that. Across 283 episodes, without ever announcing that he was changing, he became something far more unusual, the single most philosophically settled character in the entire show, standing quietly beside a boy who spends a full decade trying to figure out who he's supposed to be. Tonight, we're going to take Jake seriously. Not as comic relief, not as the side character who occasionally gets a surprisingly emotional episode, as a fully worked out way of living, built out of shape-shifting, fatherhood, cosmic weirdness, and an almost impossible ability to let things be what they are. What does Jake actually believe about failure, love, family, death, and the strange problem of becoming yourself? Why is he almost never afraid in the way everyone around him is? And how did a talking dog become the character who seems to understand existence better than the heroes, the kings, the wizards, and even the gods? Get comfortable. 11 sections, slow and unhurried, the way Jake himself tends to approach almost everything. We'll start with a thing that looks like a cartoon superpower and turns out to be something much stranger. The fact that Jake can become almost anything and almost never feels the need to. Section 1. The Shapeshifter's Creed. Flexibility as a wave life. Jake can stretch. He can shrink. He can grow to the size of a building, split himself into smaller versions of himself, reshape his own body into tools, weapons, furniture, whatever a given moment happens to require. That's the headline power, the thing you'd put on a trading card if this show had trading cards. But the interesting philosophical question was never what Jake can become, it's what he chooses to become, and how rarely that choice is dramatic. Think about how most characters in fiction who possess shape-shifting ability tend to use it. It's usually treated as a tool for disguise, for infiltration, for gaining an advantage nobody thought coming. Jake uses his stretching for almost none of that. He uses it to make a hammock, to act as a trampoline for Finn, to become a makeshift umbrella or a bridge across a gap, or simply a softer landing for someone who's about to fall. The single most cosmically strange ability the show ever gives a main character gets deployed episode after episode in service of exactly the smallest, most domestic, most unglamorous purposes imaginable. That's worth sitting with slowly because it's the entire thesis of who Jake is, compressed into a single recurring choice. He has, quite literally, the capacity to become almost anything, and what he keeps choosing to become is useful, comfortable, and quietly generous. Not impressive, not intimidating, useful. There's a version of this show where Jake's powers get treated the way most shape-shifting abilities get treated in fiction, as a source of anxiety about identity, about what's real underneath all the transformation, about whether a being this fluid can actually be anyone at all. This show almost entirely declines that anxiety. Jake doesn't seem troubled by his own fluidity. If anything, he seems to have made peace with it more completely than almost any other character in the show has made peace with anything. There's a reading of this worth taking seriously. Jake's relationship to his own shape might be the clearest possible metaphor this show ever builds for a specific kind of psychological flexibility, the capacity to bend around the situation rather than insisting the situation bend around you. Compare this directly to Finn, who spends much of the show rigid in exactly the way Jake never is, attached to being the hero, attached to specific outcomes, prone to genuine distress when the world refuses to match the shape he expected it to take. Jake almost never experiences that particular kind of distress. When circumstances shift, he shifts with them, literally and temperamentally, in a way that reads less like a superpower and more like a fully developed emotional discipline that simply happens to also come with physical special effects. It's worth asking why the show gives this specific quality to the dog rather than to the boy, because that choice carries its own quiet argument. Finn is explicitly the one being trained, across the entire runtime, in how to be a person, how to handle loss, how to manage anger, how to know when to fight and when to let something go. Jake, notably, doesn't need that same arc. He arrives in the story already more or less settled in himself, already capable of the flexibility Finn will spend the decade learning in fragments. That structural choice means Jake functions throughout the whole series less as a student alongside Finn and more as a living demonstration of where the lessons are actually supposed to lead. He's not simply comic relief standing next to the real emotional arc. He's the finished version of the thing Finn is still becoming. There's something worth noticing too in how rarely Jake's flexibility gets framed as effortful. He doesn't visibly struggle to remain calm, doesn't grit his teeth through difficult moments the way a character forcing themselves toward equanimity typically would. His ease reads as genuine rather than performed, which raises a gentle question worth sitting with. Was this simply his nature from the start, an inherent trait requiring no real cultivation? Or is what we're actually watching the result of discipline so thoroughly internalized that it no longer looks like discipline at all? The show never answers this directly, and it's worth holding both possibilities at once rather than settling too quickly on either. Some ease is given, some ease is earned so completely that it eventually stops looking earned. Jake's specific brand of loose, unbothered flexibility could plausibly be either, or some blend of both that the show simply never asks you to untangle. It's worth adding one more layer to this before we move on, because it's easy to treat flexibility as a purely positive, uncomplicated trait without asking what it might cost. A being who bends around every circumstance rather than insisting on his own shape could, in a less carefully written character, come across as someone without a genuine center, infinitely adaptable in a way that starts to look less like wisdom and more like an absence of self. Jake never reads that way, and it's worth naming precisely why. His flexibility is never shown extending to his actual values. He bends around inconvenience, around discomfort, around circumstances that don't matter enough to hold rigid. He does not bend around loyalty, around love, around the basic commitments that define who he actually is underneath all that adaptability. That distinction is the entire difference between flexibility as wisdom and flexibility as emptiness, and this show, largely without ever stating the distinction directly, keeps it scrupulously clear across every single episode Jake appears in. There's a further thought worth resting on here, tying this specific quality back to the show's broader interest in impermanence, a theme we've traced at length across earlier deep dives into other corners of this mythology. Where other major characters treat impermanence as a problem requiring some form of resolution, grief to process, loss to eventually make peace with, a fear of change to be slowly worked through across years or centuries, Jake seems to have arrived already on the other side of that particular struggle. His body doesn't resist change, it embodies it, literally, as a standing physical fact rather than as an achievement he's still working toward. Watching him move through the show is, in a sense, watching what it looks like when someone has genuinely, thoroughly made their peace with impermanence, rather than merely tolerating it. That's worth appreciating as something considerably rarer in fiction and in life than it might initially seem. It's worth closing this expanded section with a final observation about scale. Everything we've discussed so far applies at the level of Jake's individual choices, episode by episode. But it's worth zooming out to notice how consistently the same pattern holds across the entire decade the show ran. 10 years of television, hundreds of episodes, countless individual moments where Jake could have chosen rigidity or genuine formlessness instead of the specific, disciplined elasticity he actually demonstrates. And the pattern simply never breaks. That consistency, sustained across a genuinely enormous body of material, is itself worth treating as evidence, A trait maintained this reliably across this much runtime, without ever once genuinely contradicting itself, stops looking like a coincidence of characterization and starts looking like exactly what this whole video has been arguing it is: a fully worked out philosophy, embodied consistently enough that it earns the name. Section 2. Where Jake actually came from. The bite in the woods. We should spend real time on Jake's origin because it's stranger than the show's casual comedic tone around him usually lets you notice, and it changes how you read everything else about who he becomes. Jake's parents, Joshua and Margaret, were adventurers before they were parents, a working pair who took on cases and investigated strange occurrences well before any of their children existed. During one of those cases, deep in some unspecified stretch of woods, they encountered a shape-shifting creature whose exact nature the show never bothers clarifying. That creature bit Joshua on the head. In the days that followed, a growth developed at the site of the bite, and that growth, eventually, is where Jake came from. Not born in the conventional sense, grown out of a wound, seeded by something the show never names, never explains, and never mentions again across its entire remaining run. It's worth sitting with how genuinely strange this is as an origin for a character this beloved, this central, this consistently treated by the show as warm and safe and comforting. Jake didn't arrive through ordinary birth, ordinary adoption, or even an ordinary magical mishap of the kind this show reaches for constantly elsewhere. He arrived through something closer to infection, an alien encounter, a bite, a growth nobody planned for or particularly wanted, culminating in the sudden, presumably startling appearance of a fully formed puppy where a wound used to be. That's a genuinely unsettling image if you slow down and actually picture it, rather than letting the show's cheerful tone carry you past it. And yet, the show never treats Jake's origin with any of the horror that image would seem to warrant. He's simply loved, immediately and completely, by the family he was grown into. Joshua and Margaret don't seem to regard him as lesser or stranger or more provisional than any child's born the ordinary way. He's simply theirs, folded into an already large, already loving family without any apparent hesitation. That's worth appreciating as its own quiet piece of the show's larger philosophy, because it means Jake's entire life begins with a demonstration of exactly the kind of unconditional acceptance he'll go on to extend to nearly everyone he encounters for the rest of the series. He was accepted first, completely, before he'd done anything to earn it. And something in that early, foundational acceptance seems to have shaped the specific, generous ease with which he moves through the rest of his life. There's a theory worth floating here about what this implies for how Jake experiences his own identity, compared to how a character with a more conventional origin might experience theirs. Most beings in this show who discover something strange about their own origin, reincarnated comets, hidden inheritances, buried family secrets, treat that discovery as destabilizing, a piece of information that forces a reckoning with who they thought they were. Jake never gets that reckoning on screen, largely because the show reveals his origin to the audience without ever dramatizing a corresponding revelation for Jake himself. He may simply not know, or may know and have long since found it remarkable. Either way, the absence of an identity crisis here is worth noticing as a choice. A character built from an alien bite, grown out of a wound, could easily have carried some low hum of existential unease about his own nature. Jake carries none of it, which suggests his sense of self was never actually built on the story of his origin in the first place. It was built on being loved immediately by the people who found him, a foundation considerably more durable than any origin story, however strange, could ever threaten. It's worth adding one more layer here, because it connects Jake's beginning to a broader pattern this show keeps returning to across its full cast. Several of the show's most central characters begin their lives in circumstances a more conventional story would treat as tragic. A girl half demon and half human, alone in the ruins of a war. A boy carrying the reincarnated essence of a cosmic comet. A princess grown out of sentient candy rather than born to any family at all. Jake's own strange, wound-born origin fits neatly into that same pattern, and the show's consistent choice across every one of these characters is to treat the strangeness of the beginning as simply a fact, rather than a wound requiring resolution. Jake, more than almost any of them, seems to have absorbed that lesson most completely. Whatever he is, wherever he came from, he doesn't experience it as something he needs to explain, defend, or resolve. He simply is what he grew into, loved by the people who found him, moving forward from there without ever needing to look back at the wound that started it all. There's a final, gentler thought worth resting on to close this section. If Jake really did emerge from something as strange and unplanned as a bite in the woods, then everything he became afterward, loyal, playful, generous, endlessly patient with a best friend who needed considerably more patience than he did, was never guaranteed by his origin. It was built afterward, day by day, inside a family willing to love something they didn't fully understand. That's worth carrying forward into the rest of tonight's video, because it recontextualizes every act of easy generosity we're about to spend the next several hours cataloging. None of it was owed to him by his own strange beginning. All of it was chosen, cultivated, practiced across an entire life built on top of an origin considerably stranger than the show's warm, comfortable tone around him ever lets you fully notice. It's worth adding one more angle here before we move forward, because it's easy to focus entirely on Jake's own experience of this origin without pausing on what it must have required of Joshua and Margaret themselves. They didn't simply witness something strange happen to a member of their family. They watched the growth appear on Joshua's own head, watched it develop over days into something none of their prior experience as adventurers had prepared them to understand, and then made the choice, apparently without extensive deliberation the show ever shows us, to simply accept and raise whatever emerged from it as their own child. That's worth naming as its own quiet act of courage, easy to overlook entirely because the show never frames it as courage at all. It's simply presented as the obvious, natural response of two people who happen to be the kind of parents capable of loving something unexpected without first needing it to make complete sense. There's a theory worth floating about what this specific family history implies for the rest of Jake's siblings and the broader shape of his childhood. A family already willing to accept a child this strange into their fold was very likely, by extension, a family organized around flexibility and acceptance more generally, rather than treating Jake's arrival as a singular exception to an otherwise rigid household. That broader family culture, if it existed the way this reading suggests, would help explain why Jake's own later ease with difference, in Lady Rainicorn, in his own children, in nearly everyone he encounters across the show's run, reads as some genuinely uncomplicated rather than hard-won. He may not have needed to fight his way toward that ease at all. He may simply have grown up already immersed in it, absorbing it the ordinary, unremarkable way children absorb the values modeled consistently around them from the very beginning. Section 3. Sucking at something. Jake's actual philosophy of failure. If you had to reduce Jake's entire worldview to a single piece of dialogue, the strongest candidate isn't a grand speech. It's a small, almost throwaway piece of advice, delivered casually, about the relationship between failure and eventual competence. The idea that struggling at something now doesn't mean you're doomed to struggle at it forever, that the discomfort of being bad at something is simply the necessary first stretch of eventually becoming decent at it. It's worth taking that idea more seriously than its casual delivery invites, because it's doing genuine philosophical work underneath the joke. Most stories about mastery tend to skip the actual middle, the tedious, humiliating, unglamorous stretch where you are simply unavoidably bad at the thing you're trying to learn. Training montages compress it into a few seconds of upbeat music. Chosen One narratives skip it entirely, granting competence as a matter of destiny rather than practice. Jake's specific formulation refuses that shortcut. He doesn't promise Finn, or anyone else who receives this advice across the show's run, that talent will simply arrive. He promises instead that the badness is temporary, structural, and survivable. Not an indictment of who you are, but simply the first necessary stretch of a process that gets better if you keep going. There's something worth noticing in how consistently he applies this same patience to things well outside the show's usual adventuring stakes. He doesn't only offer this wisdom before a big fight or a dangerous quest. He offers versions of it about cooking, about art, about ordinary hobbies that have nothing to do with heroism at all. That range matters because it means the philosophy isn't really about mastering combat or overcoming villains. It's a general theory of how competence works, full stop. applicable to anything a person might want to eventually be good at, delivered with the same unbothered ease whether the stakes are cosmic or completely mundane. It's worth asking where this particular patience actually comes from, because it isn't universal across the show's cast. Several other major characters, Finn especially in his early seasons, treat their own early failures as genuinely distressing, evidence of inadequacy rather than simply the expected texture of learning something new. Jake doesn't share that distress, and it's worth wondering whether his comfort with early incompetence traces back to his own strange, unglamorous origin. A being grown out of a wound in the woods, accepted immediately and completely by a family that had no idea what he'd eventually become, may have simply never absorbed the specific cultural pressure that treats early struggle as a referendum on someone's worth. He wasn't measured against a standard from the very beginning. He was simply loved, and then allowed to become whatever he was going to become on his own unhurried timeline. That kind of early, unconditional acceptance is worth naming as a plausible root of the patience he extends to everyone else's early failures later on. He never had to prove himself to earn love in the first place, so he doesn't seem to expect anyone else to prove themselves either before extending them the same basic kindness. There's a version of this philosophy worth spelling out more directly, because it's easy to hear sucking at something is fine as simple reassurance without noticing the more demanding claim buried underneath it. The claim isn't that failure doesn't matter, it's that failure is data. Evidence of an early stage in a process rather than a verdict on a person's fundamental capacity. That's a considerably more useful frame than either extreme it sits between. Neither the harsh insistence that struggle proves inadequacy, nor the empty reassurance that everyone's naturally good at everything if they just believe in themselves. Jake's actual position is quieter and more specific than either. You will be bad at this. That's fine. That's simply what being bad at something new looks like on the way to eventually being less bad at it, provided you keep showing up. It's worth closing this section with the observation that Jake rarely, if ever, offers this advice as a lecture. It comes out sideways, mid-conversation, delivered with the same relaxed cadence he uses for almost everything else he says. That delivery matters as much as the content. A philosophy about the acceptability of early failure delivered with visible urgency or intensity would undercut its own message. It would suggest that failure is in fact something worth being anxious about, worth correcting quickly and seriously. Jake's casual tone is itself part of the argument. If even the advice about not panicking over failure is delivered without panic, without urgency, without any sense that this is a crisis requiring immediate resolution, then the advice becomes considerably more credible than it would be coming from someone more visibly invested in fixing the problem right away. He isn't trying to rescue anyone from their own early incompetence. He's simply letting them know, gently, that it isn't the emergency it currently feels like. It's worth adding one final layer before we move to the next section, because there's a specific kind of courage embedded in this philosophy that's easy to miss if you only focus on how comforting it sounds. Telling someone that early failure is fine requires a genuine, settled confidence that things generally do improve with sustained effort, a confidence Jake seems to hold not as blind optimism, but as something closer to observed, repeated experience. He's watched enough things, across enough of his own life, go from clumsy to competent that the pattern has become, for him, simply a reliable fact about how learning works, rather than a hopeful guess. That distinction matters. Comfort offered from genuine, tested confidence lands very differently than comfort offered as empty reassurance, and it's worth crediting Jake's specific version of this wisdom as belonging unmistakably to the first category rather than the second. Section 4. The Dad Joke Cosmology. Casual wisdom as deep structure. It's worth spending real time on the specific texture of how Jake actually talks, because the show's comedic register around him, the puns, the deliberately bad jokes, the loose, unhurried cadence of nearly everything he says, is doing more structural work than it initially appears to, and it's worth taking that seriously rather than treating it purely as comic filler between more meaningful scenes. Most of this show's genuinely profound moments across its full run arrive through characters who are visibly, audibly moved. Raised voices, tears, music signaling the audience that something important is happening. Jake almost never gets that treatment, even in scenes where what he's actually saying carries real emotional or philosophical weight. He delivers his most quietly important lines the same way he delivers a joke about waffles, flat, unhurried, occasionally punctuated with a small laugh at his own expense. That consistency of tone is worth noticing directly because it means the show is quietly training its audience across 10 seasons not to rely on tonal cues to identify which moments actually matter. Some of the most important things Jake ever says are ride disguised as nothing in particular, and the show trusts you to notice the weight underneath the casualness rather than having the casualness announce in advance that something significant is about to happen. There's a genuine argument worth making that this delivery style is itself a piece of Jake's larger philosophy rather than simply a stylistic choice layered on top of it. A character who insists on gravity every time he says something meaningful is in a subtle way treating meaning as something that requires special handling, set apart from ordinary conversation, elevated, marked as different from the rest of what gets said in an average day. Jake's flat, joke-adjacent delivery refuses that separation. Important things and unimportant things get delivered in the exact same register, which suggests structurally that he doesn't actually experience them as belonging to different categories in the first place. Wisdom, in Jake's mouth, isn't a special occasion. It's simply one more thing that comes up in conversation alongside jokes about waffles and complaints about being hungry. Because as far as he's concerned, all of it is simply part of an ordinary day's worth of talking. It's worth pairing this observation with something else worth noticing about Jake's specific brand of humor: how rarely it's actually cruel. This show has plenty of characters whose comedy leans toward mockery, toward getting a laugh at someone else's expense. Jake's humor almost never works that way. It's built out of puns, non sequiturs, gentle absurdity, the kind of joke that invites everyone in the room to laugh together rather than at any specific person. That's worth reading as a deliberate extension of the same underlying generosity we've traced across every other section of tonight's video. Even his comedy is structured around inclusion rather than exclusion. Nobody has to be the butt of the joke for Jake's jokes to land, which is a considerably rarer trait in comedic writing than it might initially seem. There's a theory worth floating about why this particular register, casual, joke-adjacent, allergic to visible gravity, ends up being such an effective vehicle for genuine wisdom, rather than undercutting it the way you might initially expect. Advice delivered with heavy, deliberate seriousness can sometimes feel like a demand, an implicit pressure to receive it with matching seriousness, to treat it as important because the deliverer has signaled that it's important. Advice delivered casually, almost as an aside, doesn't make that same demand. It leaves room for the listener to take it or leave it, to laugh along with the joke wrapped around it, and still walk away with the substance underneath, without ever having felt lectured to. Jake's entire mode of communication, across the whole show, seems built around exactly that kind of low-pressure delivery. Genuinely useful things, offered without insistence, in a form easy enough to receive that the receiving itself never feels like work. It's worth closing this section with a final thought about what this means for how the show as a whole handles its own philosophical content. A show that delivered all of its deepest ideas through solemn, clearly marked, important scenes would eventually train its audience to only pay attention during those specific moments, tuning out everything in between as filler. This show, largely through Jake's specific voice, refuses to let that training happen. Important things might show up anywhere, in the middle of a joke, in an offhand comment about waffles, in a piece of advice delivered so casually it's easy to miss entirely on a first watch. That refusal to mark its own significance clearly is, in its own way, one of the more sophisticated things this show ever does structurally. And Jake, more than any other single character, is the vehicle through which that refusal actually operates. It's worth adding one final observation before we move forward, tying this section's whole argument back to the specific format of tonight's video itself. A video built to be listened to while falling asleep is, in its own way, borrowing the exact same trust Jake's delivery style asks of its audience. The trust that meaning doesn't require alertness to land, that something can be received gently, half-attentively, without full active focus, and still leave something behind afterward. That's worth holding on to as you drift further into tonight. You don't need to catch every word of what follows for it to still be doing something. Jake never needed you fully alert to receive what he was offering either. Section 5. Loyalty without hierarchy, what Jake and Finn's brotherhood actually teaches. At the center of this entire show sits a relationship that could easily have been built on hierarchy, and rarely, if ever, actually is. Jake is older, more experienced, considerably more powerful in raw ability, and functions in nearly every practical sense as something between an older brother and a surrogate parent to a boy who has, for most of the show's run, no other adult steadily present in his daily life. That's a structural setup that would, in most stories, produce a clearly defined power dynamic, the wiser figure guiding, correcting, occasionally overruling the less experienced one. This show almost entirely refuses that shape. It's worth actually cataloging how rarely Jake pulls rank on Finn, given how easily he could. He has abilities Finn doesn't have. He has centuries less life experience than some of the show's other long-lived characters, but considerably more than a human boy still working out who he's supposed to be. And yet the show consistently frames their relationship as a partnership between equals, rather than a mentorship between unequal parties. Jake defers to Finn's judgment as often as he offers his own. He follows Finn into plans he privately doubts, trusting the process of watching Finn work through a decision rather than simply overwriting it with his own greater experience. That deference is worth noticing as a genuine philosophical choice, not simply a structural necessity of a story that needs its nominal protagonist to keep making the calls. There's something worth extracting from this about what genuine loyalty actually requires, as distinct from what hierarchy dressed up as loyalty usually looks like. A relationship built on hierarchy tends to protect the more experienced party's authority above almost everything else. Corrections get delivered as corrections. Mistakes get framed as failures to properly listen. And the less experienced party's growth gets measured primarily by how well they eventually learn to defer. Jake's version of loyalty does something considerably rare. It protects Finn's autonomy first, even when that autonomy produces outcomes Jake could have prevented by simply asserting his greater experience. He lets Finn fail, repeatedly, across the entire run of the show, not because he's indifferent to the outcome, but because he seems to understand, instinctively, that Finn's growth requires the actual experience of failing and recovering, not simply the information that failure was likely. It's worth pairing this with a specific way the show handles disagreement between them, because disagreement between Jake and Finn almost never escalates into the kind of extended conflict that would define a more hierarchical relationship. They argue, sometimes genuinely, but the arguments tend to resolve quickly, without either party needing to fully win or fully concede. That pattern is worth reading as evidence of a relationship built on something considerably more durable than either party being consistently right. It's built on trust that the relationship itself can absorb disagreement without needing every disagreement to be fully resolved before the next adventure starts. Compare this to relationships elsewhere in the show's cast that fracture badly, sometimes for centuries, over exactly the kind of unresolved tension Jake and Finn seem to metabolize almost effortlessly. Whatever Jake is doing differently, and it's worth naming this directly, seems to be some combination of genuinely not needing to be right and genuinely trusting Finn to eventually arrive somewhere reasonable on his own. There's a theory worth floating about where this specific style of loyalty actually comes from, tying it back to Jake's own family history. Joshua and Margaret, Jake's parents, are depicted as loving but imperfect, capable of real warmth, and also, in some of the show's later material, shown to have their own complicated history with control, favoritism, and the specific weight of raising a large, unusual family. Jake, watching that dynamic across his own childhood, may have absorbed something valuable from noticing what didn't work as often as from noticing what did. A parent's occasional overreach, witnessed early enough and often enough, can produce in a child either a mirrored instinct toward control or a considered deliberate swing in the opposite direction. Jake's own approach to Finn reads across the whole show like the second option, a conscious, sustained choice to lead with trust rather than correction, built at least partly in response to whatever he noticed didn't fully work in his own upbringing. It's worth adding one final thought here before we move to the next section, tying this particular quality back to something we've already established about Jake's own upbringing. A being raised with genuine unconditional acceptance, never having to earn his place in a family that welcomed him strangely and completely from the very start, would very plausibly grow into exactly the kind of adult who gives that same unconditional welcome forward, without keeping score, without needing the relationship to feel reciprocal in equal measure at every single moment. Finn needed more from Jake across most of the show's run than Jake structurally needed back from Finn, and Jake never once treats that imbalance as a debt owed to him. That's worth naming directly as one of the clearest, most consistent demonstrations of everything this whole video has been building toward. Love and loyalty that were given first, completely, without requiring proof, tend to produce people capable of extending that exact same gift to someone else, patiently for as long as it takes. Section 6. Lady Rainicorn and the philosophy of loving across difference. Jake's relationship with Lady Rainicorn deserves more careful attention than the show's own casual treatment of it initially invites, because underneath the comedy of a stretchy dog dating a rainbow-colored Korean-speaking unicorn is a genuinely thoughtful argument about what it actually takes to love someone whose entire frame of reference is meaningfully different from your own. The most immediately obvious barrier between them is linguistic. Lady Rainicorn speaks almost exclusively in Korean throughout the show's run, and the English-speaking audience is, for most of the series, given no direct translation. Jake, notably, understands her completely. That detail is worth sitting with because the show never treats his understanding as a plot device requiring explanation. It's simply presented as fact. He learned her language fully, thoroughly, without ever making a production of the effort involved. That's worth reading as its own quiet philosophical statement about what genuine love across real difference actually requires. Not a shortcut, not a magical translation device, but the actual unglamorous work of learning someone else's language well enough to understand them completely, done without complaint and without ever asking for credit. It's worth noticing how rarely the show plays this specific relationship for easy comedy at either party's expense. Interspecies or cross-cultural relationships in a lot of comedic fiction tend to generate humor from the gap itself. Jokes about misunderstanding, about incompatibility, about two people fundamentally unable to bridge whatever separates them. Jake and Lady Rainicorn's relationship isn't built that way. The gap between them is acknowledged, visually and linguistically, in nearly every scene they share, and it's never treated as an obstacle the show needs the audience to laugh at. It's simply the actual shape of their specific relationship navigated competently, affectionately, without much visible friction. That's a genuinely unusual choice for a show working largely in a comedic register, and it's worth crediting directly as evidence of how seriously this particular relationship is actually being treated underneath its lighter surface presentation. There's a theory worth building out here about what Jake's specific approach to this relationship reveals about his broader philosophy of connection. He doesn't ask Lady Rainicorn to become more legible to him. He doesn't request that she learn his language instead, or meet him halfway in some more convenient middle ground. He does the entire work of crossing the gap himself, learning her language fully, adapting to her rather than expecting her to adapt to him. That's worth reading as a direct extension of the same flexibility we spent our first section discussing, the shapeshifter who bends around circumstances rather than insisting circumstances bend around him, applied here specifically to the difficult, ongoing work of loving someone whose entire frame of reference differs meaningfully from his own. It's worth pairing this with what the relationship eventually produces: children, several of them, each one inheriting some blend of Jake's stretchy canine nature and Lady Rainicorn's own distinct heritage, each one distinctly, visibly different from either parent and from each other. That outcome is worth appreciating as the natural, almost inevitable extension of everything we've traced about how this relationship actually functions. A partnership built on one party doing the genuine work of crossing difference rather than erasing it produces, quite literally in this case, children who embody difference rather than resolving it into sameness. The puppies aren't uniform. They aren't simplified blends splitting the difference evenly between their parents. They're each their own distinct combination, which mirrors, at the level of an entire new generation, the same commitment to difference without erasure that defined their parents' relationship in the first place. There's a final layer worth adding before we move to the next section, because it's easy to read all of this analysis and lose sight of the fact that the show, on the surface,
treats this entire relationship with remarkable lightness. Jake and Lady Rainicorn are shown, repeatedly, simply enjoying each other's company, writing together, laughing together, existing together with an ease that never announces itself as effortful, despite everything we've just spent this section establishing about how much actual effort must have gone into building that ease in the first place. That's worth holding as its own small, important truth. The deepest, most genuinely effortful work in a relationship, done well enough and long enough, eventually stops looking like effort at all. It simply looks like two people, or one dog and one rainbow unicorn, enjoying an ordinary afternoon together. The difficulty of everything that got them there folded so completely into the relationship's foundation that it barely shows on the surface anymore. It's worth closing this section with one final, quieter observation, because it's easy to end a discussion like this one focused entirely on what Jake gave to this relationship, at the risk of making Lady Rainicorn sound like a passive recipient of his effort, rather than a genuine partner in her own right. The show is careful, in the moments it does give her real screen time, to depict her as capable, opinionated, and entirely her own person. Someone Jake chose to build this relationship with specifically, rather than someone who simply happened to be convenient. That distinction matters. The effort we've spent this whole section crediting to Jake was never charity extended towards someone lesser. It was the ordinary, considerable work any genuine partnership between equals requires, made unusually visible here specifically because the difference between them happened to be linguistic and biological, rather than simply personal, the way it more typically is in relationships between two people who look and sound the same, but still, somehow, have to learn each other from scratch. Section 7. Jake Jr. and the Puppies. Fatherhood, Multiplicity, and Letting Go. Jake becomes a father across the show's run several times over, to a litter of puppies each distinctly different from one another and from him. It's worth spending real time on what the show actually does with this fatherhood, because it deviates in genuinely interesting ways from how parenthood tends to get handled elsewhere in this mythology, and elsewhere in fiction more generally. The most immediately noticeable thing is how little Jake seems invested in his children resembling him. Several of the puppies inherit almost none of his stretching ability, developing instead their own distinct talents, temperaments, and interests that owe more to Lady Rainicorn's side of the family, or to nothing recognizably parental at all. A parent more invested in legacy and continuity, in seeing themselves reflected forward into the next generation, might have treated that divergence as a quiet disappointment. Jake doesn't. He seems, across every scene the show gives us of him as a father, genuinely delighted by whoever each of his children actually turns out to be, entirely independent of how closely they resemble him.
It's worth reading this as a direct continuation of everything we've traced across this video so far. The same flexibility that defines his relationship to his own body, his own failures, his own romantic partnership, extends naturally into his relationship with his children. He doesn't need them to become extensions of himself in order to love them completely. He simply loves whoever they turn out to be, the way he was loved, unconditionally, by parents who accepted a puppy grown from a strange wound in the woods without ever needing him to prove himself first. That continuity across generations, unconditional acceptance passed forward, essentially unchanged, from Joshua and Margaret to Jake to his own children, is worth naming directly as one of the quieter, more moving through lines this entire mythology ever builds. There's a specific son worth spending extra time on, because his arc complicates the easy version of the story in a way worth taking seriously. One of Jake's children grows up considerably faster than the others, ages rapidly across a compressed span of time, and eventually becomes an adult while his siblings are still comparatively young. That accelerated aging forces Jake into a version of fatherhood most parents never have to experience in compressed form. Watching a child grow up, leave, and eventually face the end of his own life, all within a span of time that would ordinarily stretch across decades. The show doesn't shy away from the grief embedded in that compression. Jake is shown genuinely struggling with it in ways that complicate the easy, endlessly patient version of him we spent most of tonight's video building up. It's worth sitting with that complication directly because it matters for how we should understand everything else we've covered. Jake's equanimity was never presented across this whole video as effortless in some magical, permanent sense. It's a practiced discipline,
genuinely earned, and genuinely tested by the specific, compressed grief of watching one of his own children live and age at a pace no parent should reasonably have to witness. That he manages to stay present through it, imperfectly, with real visible difficulty, is worth appreciating as considerably more impressive than if the show had simply let his usual ease carry him through untouched. The philosophy holds up, under real pressure. It doesn't hold up effortlessly, and the show is honest about that difference. There's a theory worth floating about what this specific storyline is actually arguing, underneath its more immediate emotional content. Most parents fear, on some level, outliving their children, and most fiction handles that fear either by avoiding it entirely or by treating it as an unambiguous, unrecoverable tragedy. This show does something more careful. It lets Jake grieve genuinely, without pretending the grief isn't real or isn't difficult, while also refusing to let that grief become the only thing that defines the relationship. The time compressed into that accelerated childhood was still real time, still full of genuine connection, still worth every bit of the eventual grief it produced. That's a considerably more mature argument than simple avoidance or simple tragedy. And it's worth crediting the show for making it through Jake specifically, the character who spent the entire rest of this mythology demonstrating exactly the kind of flexible, unresentful presence that grief this specific would most severely test. It's worth closing this section with a gentler observation about the rest of Jake's children, the ones who don't experience this same compressed timeline. They grow up ordinarily, gradually, each one distinct, each one loved without condition, each one eventually finding their own path separate from their father's. Jake, across every glimpse the show gives us of this later stage of fatherhood, seems genuinely at peace with that separation, not clinging, not attempting to keep his children close past the point where closeness serves them, simply letting them go, the way he's let go of nearly everything else across this entire video's worth of careful attention. That letting go, practiced this consistently across this many different domains of his life, might be the single clearest through line connecting every section we've covered so far. Jake holds things loosely. He always has. And somehow, across an entire mythology built largely around loss, that loose-handed approach to holding what he loves seems to have cost him considerably less grief than almost anyone else in this story who's tried to hold on tighter. There's one final thought worth adding before we move to the next section, because it's worth naming the specific courage embedded in choosing to let a child go before you're actually forced to by circumstance. Most letting go in fiction and in life happens under duress. A child leaves for college, a relationship simply runs its course, circumstance forces separation whether either party wants it or not. Jake's version of letting go reads as considerably more deliberate than that. He doesn't wait to be forced. He seems to actively and consistently choose not to hold on past the point where holding on would start to serve himself rather than the child in question. That's worth naming as its own distinct skill, separate from simple acceptance of loss after the fact. The harder, rarer skill of releasing your grip before circumstance makes you, because you've correctly identified that continuing to hold on has stopped being about anyone's genuine well-being and started being about your own difficulty imagining life without the holding. Section 8. The Alien Inheritance. What it means that Jake was never fully normal. We touched briefly in our earlier section on his origin on the fact that Jake carries genuinely alien heritage, something not of this world, seeded into him through a bite nobody in his family ever fully explains or investigates further. It's worth returning to this fact directly, because it shapes something worth naming clearly about Jake's entire relationship to the category of normal, a category most of this show's other characters spend at least some energy either trying to claim or trying to escape.
Finn spends a meaningful portion of the show believing himself to be the last human alive, carrying real weight around that specific kind of otherness, the loneliness of being fundamentally different from everyone around him, the quiet ache of never quite belonging to the world he's grown up in. Marceline carries her own version of this, half demon and half human, never fully fitting into either category cleanly. Jake, notably, never seems to carry an equivalent weight around his own strangeness,
despite having, by any reasonable measure, one of the stranger origins in the entire main cast. He doesn't perform otherness as tragedy. He doesn't perform it as triumph either. He simply doesn't seem to treat it as a category worth organizing his identity around at all. It's worth asking why that specific indifference exists in him and not, to nearly the same degree, in anyone else this mythology spends real time with. Part of the answer we discussed earlier likely traces back to the unconditional acceptance he received from Joshua and Margaret from the very beginning. Never having to earn belonging in the first place meant never having to organize his identity around proving it. But there's a second piece worth adding here, specific to what alien heritage actually means functionally for how Jake experiences reality compared to everyone around him. His stretching, his shape-shifting, his entire physical relationship to the ordinary rules of matter and space that govern everyone else in Ooo, none of that is magic in the way most of this show's other supernatural abilities are magic, tied to elemental cycles or ancient curses or reincarnated cosmic principles. It's simply what he is, biologically, inherited from something entirely outside this world's own internal mythology. That distinction matters more than it might initially seem. Nearly everything else strange about this show's cast connects, eventually, to some piece of the larger cosmic architecture we spent other deep dives excavating. Comets, elementals, demon heritage, ancient curses. Jake's strangeness connects to none of it. He's an outlier even among the show's outliers, carrying an inheritance from somewhere the mythology never bothers mapping, untethered from the elaborate cosmic bureaucracy governing nearly everyone else's supernatural nature. There's something worth appreciating in that specific kind of freedom. Every other magically significant character in this show is, in some sense, playing a role assigned to them by forces considerably larger than themselves: a comet's reincarnation, an elemental cycle, a crown's imprinted template. Jake's nature was never assigned by any of that architecture. It arrived randomly from somewhere unexplained, uncoordinated with anything else happening in this universe's larger cosmic structure. Which means whatever Jake becomes with that nature is, in a genuinely unusual way for this particular mythology, entirely his own to decide. It's worth pairing this of a small, specific piece of evidence. Jake never seems interested in learning more about his own alien origins, never mounts any quest to understand the creature that bit his father, never expresses curiosity about whether more beings like whatever fathered him might exist somewhere out in the wider world. That absence of curiosity is worth noticing directly because it stands in genuine contrast to how nearly every other character in the show handles a piece of mysterious personal history. Marceline spends real energy reconstructing her own past. Active Finn actively investigates the truth about his parents and his own cosmic reincarnation. Jake simply doesn't. His relationship to his own unresolved origin is one of the show's clearest demonstrations of a genuinely, thoroughly practiced indifference to needing every question about yourself fully answered before you're allowed to move forward with an ordinary, contented life. There's a theory worth floating about what this specific kind of indifference actually costs and doesn't cost him. A character less settled than Jake might carry some quiet anxiety underneath that apparent indifference, an unexamined wound papered over rather than genuinely resolved. The show never gives us clear evidence either way, and it's worth resisting the urge to assume his ease must be concealing something darker, simply because that would make for a more dramatically satisfying reading. Sometimes indifference is simply indifference. Sometimes a question genuinely doesn't need answering in order for a person to live a full, contented life. And Jake's entire character across his whole video suggests he's one of the rare fictional examples of someone who's actually genuinely made peace with that possibility, rather than merely performing peace while something unresolved quietly festers underneath it. It's worth closing this section with a final thought about what Jake's alien, uncategorized nature means for how he moves through a world that's otherwise deeply organized around cosmic hierarchy and assigned roles. Nearly everyone else in this mythology is playing a part scripted, at least partially, by something older and larger than themselves. Jake, arriving from outside all of that architecture, gets to simply be a dog, a good one, a loyal one, an occasionally very silly one, without ever needing to reconcile that ordinary identity with some grander cosmic destiny waiting underneath it. There's something worth genuinely envying in that freedom, and it's worth wondering whether Jake's remarkable ease across every other domain we've covered tonight traces back, at least in part, to this one foundational fact. He's never had to carry the weight of being cosmically significant. He simply gets to be Jake, fully, without a larger architecture demanding he become anything else. It's worth adding one final, gentler thought before we move into the next section, because it's worth naming directly what this freedom actually feels like from the inside, as best as video can imagine it. Most of the characters we've discussed across this channel's other deep dives carry some version of cosmic obligation, a role to fulfill, a prophecy to either satisfy or resist, an inheritance demanding to be claimed or refused. Jake carries none of that weight, and the show never once suggests he's missing out by its absence. If anything, the opposite seems true. Every other character's cosmic significance tends to come bundled with real cost, isolation, pressure, the specific exhaustion of mattering to something larger than an ordinary life can comfortably hold. Jake simply gets to matter to the people directly around him, fully, without that mattering ever needing to scale up into anything grander. That might be the quietest, most genuinely enviable thing this entire mythology ever offers any of its characters. And it's worth sitting with the possibility that smaller, more ordinary significance, chosen and sustained this consistently, might actually be worth more than the cosmic kind everyone else in the story ends up carrying instead.
We opened tonight's video with Jake's shapeshifting as a starting point. And it's worth returning to that same ability now, considerably deeper into the video with everything else we've covered in mind, because there's a specific dimension of it worth examining that we haven't yet fully unpacked: the relationship between physical elasticity and emotional resilience, and what it actually means that this show chose to make those two things literally the same power in the same character. Elastic materials share a specific property worth naming precisely. They can absorb considerable force, deform significantly under pressure, and then return to something close to their original shape once the pressure is removed. That's meaningfully different from either rigidity, which resists pressure until it eventually breaks, or true formlessness, which offers no resistance at all and simply gets reshaped permanently by whatever pushes against it. Elasticity sits between those two failure modes, offering genuine give without genuine collapse. It's worth taking that physical property seriously as a deliberate metaphor for the specific kind of emotional resilience Jake demonstrates across the entire show, because the metaphor holds up remarkably well once you actually trace it through his character. Compare Jake's response to hardship against the two failure modes elasticity sits between. A rigid response to hardship, refusing to bend, insisting on maintaining exactly the same shape regardless of what's pressing against you, tends to work until it doesn't, holding firm through moderate pressure and then breaking catastrophically once the pressure exceeds what rigidity can withstand. We see versions of this failure mode elsewhere across this mythology, in characters whose refusal to bend eventually costs them everything at once, dramatically rather than gradually. A formless response, by contrast, offers no resistance and simply gets permanently reshaped by whatever happens to it, every hardship leaving a lasting deformation, nothing ever returning to what it was before. We see versions of this failure mode too, in characters whose identity gets genuinely, permanently altered by every major loss they experience. Jake demonstrates neither failure mode with any real consistency. He bends visibly under real pressure. His grief over his rapidly aging son, discussed in our previous section, is genuine evidence that pressure affects him rather than simply sliding off him without consequence. But he also consistently, across the entire show, returns to something recognizably himself afterward, rather than being permanently reshaped by any single hardship into someone unrecognizable from who he was before it. That specific combination, genuine deformation under pressure, genuine return to shape afterward, is exactly what elasticity as a physical property actually describes, which makes the metaphor considerably less incidental than it might initially appear. This show gave its most emotionally resilient character a literal physical superpower that models, at the level of simple physics, the exact psychological quality that superpower turns out to represent. It's worth pushing this metaphor a little further because elasticity has one more property worth naming. It has limits. Stretch any elastic material far enough past a certain threshold, and it stops returning to its original shape or breaks outright. That limit is worth taking seriously as part of the metaphor too, rather than assuming Jake's resilience is somehow infinite or automatic. The show never actually tests those limits directly with Jake, the way it tests limits with some of its other long-lived patient characters. We don't get a scene of Jake genuinely, permanently broken by something too large for even his considerable capacity to bend and recover. Whether that's because the show simply never needed that story, or because it deliberately protected this particular character from that specific kind of test, is worth wondering about honestly, rather than assuming his resilience was simply guaranteed by his nature to never actually fail. There's a theory worth floating about why the show might have made that specific choice, protecting Jake from the kind of total, permanent breaking it's willing to inflict on nearly every other major character across its run. Every long-running story needs at least one character who models what durable, sustainable resilience actually looks like, if only to give the audience a felt sense of what the alternative to constant, escalating tragedy could look like. If every single character in this show eventually broke under sufficient pressure, the mythology would offer nothing but an accumulating catalog of loss, with no counterexample demonstrating that a different, more sustainable relationship to hardship was actually possible. Jake functions across the entire run as exactly that counterexample. Proof, sustained across 10 seasons, that bending without breaking is a genuinely available option, not simply a fantasy the show gestures toward without actually demonstrating. It's worth closing this section with a specific small detail worth carrying forward. Jake's stretching ability requires no special preparation, no ritual, no cost paid in advance, the way some of this show's other magic requires. He simply stretches whenever the moment calls for it, and returns to his ordinary shape whenever it doesn't. That effortlessness is worth reading as its own quiet argument about the nature of genuine resilience, as distinct from the more effortful, visibly costly versions of endurance this show shows elsewhere. Some resilience looks like gritted teeth and visible sacrifice. Jake's looks like simply bending easily, because bending is what he's built to do, and then simply being himself again once the pressure passes, without needing to announce how much the bending cost him along the way. Section 10. Growing Old. What the show implies about Jake's eventual death. We should spend real time tonight on something the show handles with unusual restraint, what actually happens to Jake eventually. Across the much longer stretch of time, this mythology implies exists beyond its own main narrative window.
We know from glimpses the show gives us in its finale and in later material revisiting these characters as adults, that Finn grows old across the eventual span of his life, that his friendship with Jake persists well into that later adulthood, and that Jake himself, by the time we get our clearest later glimpses of this timeline, has died, his passing referenced rather than dramatized directly, marked by Finn carrying a tattoo of him rather than by any extended on-screen farewell. That choice is worth sitting with carefully, because it's a genuinely unusual way to handle the death of a character this central, this beloved, across a story willing to spend real, extended screen time on other losses throughout its run. It's worth asking why the show chooses restraint specifically here, when it hasn't shown similar restraint with plenty of its other major losses. Simon's transformation gets an entire dedicated emotional architecture built around it. Marceline's centuries of grief get extensive, careful treatment across multiple episodes and specials. Jake's actual death gets almost none of that direct dramatization. We're simply shown its aftermath, quietly, through a single tattoo, worn by an older Finn who has clearly already done the bulk of his grieving by the time we're allowed to see him again. There's a theory worth building here about what this restraint is actually doing, rather than simply reading it as an oversight or a gap the show didn't have time to fill.
Given everything we've spent tonight establishing about who Jake actually is, his ease with impermanence, his consistent refusal to hold onto things too tightly, his demonstrated capacity to bend around loss rather than being permanently reshaped by it, a large dramatized death scene might have actually contradicted the philosophy his entire character spent 10 seasons building. Jake never needed his own losses to be treated as maximally significant events requiring extended narrative weight. He processed grief quietly, sideways, without insisting on the spotlight even when the spotlight would have been entirely earned. It's worth wondering whether the show extends that same restraint to his own eventual death out of a kind of narrative respect, letting him go the way he lived, without ceremony, without insisting that his ending be treated as more significant than the quiet, generous life that preceded it. It's worth pairing this with what the tattoo itself actually represents, because it's a genuinely specific choice worth unpacking rather than reading simply as a generic memorial gesture. A tattoo is permanent, carried on the body, visible in every subsequent moment of the person wearing it, without requiring any active maintenance or deliberate remembering. Finn doesn't need to consciously think about Jake in order for the tattoo to still be there. It's simply part of him now, integrated into his body the way Jake's own presence was integrated into his life for the entire span of their friendship. That's worth reading as a genuinely thoughtful piece of symbolism. Grief, done well enough and long enough, eventually stops requiring active maintenance and simply becomes part of the ongoing shape of a life, present without needing to be constantly consciously revisited. There's a further thought worth adding here about what it means that this tattoo, specifically, is the piece of evidence the show chooses to give us, rather than any of the more conventional memorial gestures available to it. A grave, a memory box, a spoken eulogy delivered on screen. A tattoo is chosen deliberately, applied once, and then simply carried forward without further decision-making required. That specific quality, a single, deliberate act of remembrance that then requires no further active maintenance, mirrors something worth naming about Jake's own approach to nearly everything across this entire video. He rarely required elaborate, ongoing ritual to hold on to what mattered to him. He simply incorporated what mattered into the basic, ongoing shape of how he lived, the way Finn incorporates his memory of Jake into the basic, ongoing shape of his own body. Even in the manner of his own remembrance, the show seems to be extending Jake's specific philosophy forward, applying it to how his best friend chooses to carry him rather than only to how Jake himself carried everything else across his own life. There's a final layer worth adding here, tying Jake's eventual death back to everything we've covered about his relationship to impermanence more generally. Across this entire video, we've traced a character who holds nearly everything loosely: his own body, his failures, his children, his own alien and largely unexamined origin. It's worth wondering whether that same loose-handed relationship extended to his own mortality as well. Whether Jake, across whatever years led up to his own eventual death, approached his own ending with something like the same ease he brought to everything else. The show never gives us direct evidence either way, since we never actually see him in his final years. But given everything we spent tonight establishing about who he consistently was, it's worth allowing yourself the gentle possibility that his own ending, whatever it actually looked like, was met with something closer to acceptance than the kind of desperate resistance this mythology shows elsewhere, in characters more attached to permanence than Jake ever seemed to be. It's worth closing this section with a small, quiet thought worth carrying into the rest of tonight. Jake spent an entire life demonstrating that things can be held loosely, loved completely, and eventually released without that release canceling out everything that came before it. If his own death was met with anything like that same philosophy, then his ending, however little of it the show actually lets us witness directly, was likely considerably more peaceful than the show's own quiet restraint around it might initially suggest. Sometimes the absence of a dramatized ending isn't a gap in the storytelling. Sometimes it's the storytelling's own quiet way of suggesting that the ending, whatever it looked like, didn't actually need an audience in order to be complete.
Section 11. The Quiet Center. Why Jake, not Finn, might be the show's actual philosophical anchor. We should close tonight by asking directly a question we've been building toward across every section so far. Why does this particular show, ostensibly about a boy's journey toward becoming a hero, keep quietly suggesting, through everything we've traced tonight, that its actual philosophical center of gravity was the dog standing next to him the entire time. Finn's arc, across the full run of the show, is one of active becoming. Learning, failing, growing, slowly working out across 10 seasons what it actually means to be a good person in a world this strange and this damaged. That arc is genuinely compelling, and it's the arc the show is nominally organized around. But it's worth noticing that Finn's growth, across nearly every major turning point in his development, consists largely of him gradually arriving at positions Jake already occupied from the very beginning. Finn learns, slowly and painfully, the patience with failure that Jake demonstrated effortlessly from his earliest appearances. Finn learns, across genuine heartbreak, the flexibility around loss that Jake seemed to have already internalized. Finn learns to trust rather than control, to bend rather than break, to hold what he loves loosely enough that losing it doesn't destroy him. All of it arriving late, hard-won, while Jake simply already lived that way the entire time, without ever needing the show to dramatize how he got there. It's worth asking what it means, structurally, for a show to build its nominal hero's entire arc around slowly catching up to a philosophy his best friend already embodied from episode 1. There's a reading worth taking seriously here. Jake was never simply a supporting character whose job was to help Finn's story along. He was the show's actual thesis statement, delivered quietly, consistently, without fanfare, for the entire run of the series, while the more visible, more actively dramatized story of Finn's growth unfolded on top of it. Finn is the show's protagonist in the conventional sense, the one making choices, driving plot, experiencing the most visible arc of change. Jake is something closer to the show's argument, present in every episode, demonstrating, patiently, what the destination of Finn's entire journey actually looks like, long before Finn himself ever arrives there. There's a theory worth floating about why the show would structure things this way, rather than simply making Jake's philosophy explicit, delivered directly to the audience through some clearer, more didactic mechanism. A philosophy demonstrated is considerably more persuasive than a philosophy stated, because demonstration doesn't ask you to simply believe a claim. It shows you the claim actually working, sustained across genuine hardship, genuine loss, genuine pressure, for the entire span of a very long show. If the writers had simply had Jake deliver his worldview as a speech early in the series, it would have registered as advice, easily agreed with in the moment and easily forgotten by the next episode. Instead, they built an entire character around living that worldview out consistently across 283 episodes, until the accumulated weight of watching it actually work, episode after episode, became considerably more convincing than any single speech could have managed. It's worth pairing this with something we touched on earlier tonight: how rarely Jake's wisdom gets marked tonally as significant. That refusal to mark its own importance is, in retrospect, part of the exact same strategy. A philosophy this thoroughly demonstrated rather than announced doesn't need dramatic emphasis to land. It simply accumulates, quietly, across enough ordinary moments that by the time the show ends, an attentive viewer has absorbed an entire coherent worldview without ever having been explicitly taught it. That's a genuinely sophisticated piece of storytelling craft, worth crediting directly. Teaching an audience an entire philosophy of resilience, flexibility, and unconditional love, primarily through consistent demonstration rather than explicit instruction, sustained patiently across a decade of television. There's a final thought worth resting on to close out this section, and it ties everything we've covered across tonight's entire video into a single, simple observation. Finn gets the hero's journey. Jake gets something quieter, and in its own way, considerably rarer: the demonstration of what a life already at peace with itself actually looks like, sustained across every kind of pressure this mythology can throw at it: failure, grief, love across genuine difference, fatherhood, and eventually, presumably, his own quiet ending. That's not a smaller story than Finn's. It might, once you've spent this many hours actually tracing it out, be the larger one,
simply told in a register too casual, too unassuming, too willing to deliver its deepest truths wrapped in a joke about waffles for most viewers to notice it was happening at all. Section 12. Jake and Fear. What bravery looks like without ego. It's worth spending real time on something easy to overlook across everything we've covered so far. Jake is, by any reasonable measure, genuinely brave repeatedly across the entire run of the show, and yet his bravery almost never reads the way bravery conventionally reads in fiction. It's worth taking that difference seriously because it reveals something specific about how his whole philosophy handles fear itself, as distinct from how it handles failure, loss, or difference, which we've already spent considerable time on tonight. Conventional fictional bravery tends to be visibly effortful. A character afraid, pushing through that fear anyway, usually shows the audience the pushing, gritted teeth, a steadying breath, some visible acknowledgement that what's about to happen is difficult and frightening and being done anyway despite that difficulty. Jake rarely gets that treatment. He walks into danger with roughly the same loose, unhurried energy he brings to making a sandwich. That's worth noticing directly because it raises a genuine question worth sitting with. Is Jake simply less afraid than everyone else, structurally incapable of the fear that makes other characters' bravery so visibly costly? Or is he exactly as afraid as anyone reasonably would be, and simply better than almost anyone else in this story at not letting that fear announce itself before he's decided how he's going to act regardless?
It's worth arguing for the second reading because the first one would make Jake considerably less interesting than the show actually treats him as being. A being simply incapable of fear isn't demonstrating anything worth learning from. He's just built differently, the same way his stretching is simply a fact of his biology rather than an earned skill. But scattered moments across the show do suggest Jake experiences something like ordinary fear, quietly, privately, without ever needing to perform it for anyone watching. He hesitates occasionally. He expresses genuine relief once a dangerous situation resolves, relief that wouldn't make sense in a being who'd felt nothing risky about the situation in the first place. That evidence, thin as it is, supports a reading of Jake as someone who feels fear the ordinary amount and has simply developed an unusually thorough practice of not letting that fear become the loudest voice in the room before he acts. There's a theory worth building here about what specifically separates that practice from either recklessness or suppression. Two considerably less admirable ways a character might arrive at the same outward calm. Recklessness ignores fear because it hasn't properly registered the actual danger involved, a kind of dangerous obliviousness dressed up as courage. Suppression registers the fear fully and then forcibly shoves it down, at some real internal cost that tends to surface elsewhere, later, in less controlled ways. Jake's version reads as neither. He seems to register danger accurately. He isn't oblivious to what's actually at stake in a given fight or crisis, and yet the fear doesn't appear to require forcible suppression either, because it never seems to swell to a size requiring that kind of active management in the first place. That's worth naming as a third category, considerably rarer in fiction than either recklessness or suppression. Fear acknowledged, held lightly, and simply not granted veto power over what happens next. It's worth connecting this directly back to the elasticity metaphor we spent an earlier section building out in detail, because fear handled this way is really just one more application of the same underlying principle. Elastic materials absorb pressure without either resisting it rigidly or being permanently reshaped by it. Fear, treated the same way, gets absorbed, genuinely felt, genuinely real, without either being denied outright or being allowed to permanently distort how Jake actually behaves in the moment it arrives. That consistency across domains, physical and emotional, is worth appreciating as further evidence of how thoroughly this single underlying philosophy actually runs through every visible piece of who Jake is, rather than being a collection of separate, unrelated character traits that simply happen to coexist. There's a final layer worth adding here, because it's worth naming what this specific relationship to fear actually costs, if anything, given how much of tonight's video has focused on the apparent ease of Jake's entire worldview. It's worth being honest that a character this consistently unbothered by danger could, in less careful hands, become genuinely difficult to root for. Invulnerability, even emotional invulnerability, tends to drain a story of real stakes if it's taken too far. This show avoids that trap specifically by keeping Jake's stakes personal rather than physical. He isn't afraid of danger to himself in any sustained way, but he is shown repeatedly genuinely afraid for the people he loves, for Finn specifically, and later for his own children. That distinction matters enormously. His courage isn't the courage of someone with nothing to lose, it's the courage of someone who has clearly identified what actually matters to him, and simply refuses to let fear about anything outside that specific, carefully bounded category dictate how he moves through the world. It's worth closing this section with a small, quiet image worth carrying forward. Somewhere in this show's run, in a moment easy to miss if you're not specifically looking for it, Jake faces something genuinely dangerous with the same loose, unbothered posture he brings to an ordinary afternoon, and then, once the danger passes, quietly checks in on whether Finn is actually okay, with a level of visible concern he never once extended to his own safety in the preceding scene. That asymmetry, calm about himself, genuinely invested in the people he loves, might be the clearest possible summary of what Jake's specific relationship to fear actually is. Not absence, redirection, toward exactly the things worth being afraid for, and away from everything else that fear, left unmanaged, tends to spend itself on instead. Section 13. The refusal of power. Why Jake never wants to be in charge of anything. It's worth spending time on something structurally significant and easy to take for granted. Across an entire show populated by characters actively seeking power, position, and authority, kingdoms to rule, thrones to inherit, cosmic destinies to claim or resist, Jake never once expresses genuine interest in being in charge of anything larger than his own immediate household. That absence is worth treating as a deliberate philosophical position rather than simply an incidental feature of his character. This matters more once you notice how many opportunities a show actually gives him to want power and declines on his behalf. He has genuinely significant abilities, considerably more raw physical versatility than most of the show's ruling monarchs ever demonstrate. He has standing, respect, a reputation built across years of heroism alongside Finn that would in most fantasy narratives eventually translate into some offer of formal authority, a kingdom of his own to govern, a title matching his accomplishments. The show never bothers extending him that offer, and more importantly, Jake never seems to have wanted it extended in the first place. It's worth comparing this directly to nearly every other significant character in the show's cast, most of whom either actively hold power, actively want it, or actively defined by their complicated relationship to power they've inherited and aren't sure they want. Princess Bubblegum's entire arc, across everything we've covered in this channel's other deep dives, is inseparable from the weight of ruling a kingdom. Marceline's story is shaped by an inheritance, the Night Sphere throne. She spent centuries actively declining to claim. Finn himself is repeatedly offered positions of authority across the show's run and treats each offer as a genuine, weighty decision requiring real consideration. Jake alone seems to simply never have this particular internal conflict at all. Authority isn't something he's actively refusing at real personal cost, like the way Marceline's refusal of the Night Sphere clearly costs her something. It's something that never seems to have registered as a want in the first place.
There's a theory worth building about what produces this specific indifference, tying it back to everything else we've established about Jake's underlying philosophy tonight. Power, in the way the show typically depicts it, requires exactly the kind of rigid, defended, carefully maintained position that runs directly against everything we've spent this entire video establishing about Jake's preference for flexibility over fixity. A throne is, in a structural sense, the opposite of elasticity, a position you're expected to hold consistently against whatever pressure arrives, rather than a shape you're free to bend around circumstances as they change. It's worth wondering whether Jake's disinterest in power isn't really about power specifically at all, but about his broader, thoroughly consistent preference for staying loose and adaptable rather than committing to any single fixed position, however prestigious that position might be. It's worth adding a further layer here, because there's a version of this argument that risks making Jake's disinterest in power sound like simple laziness rather than a genuine philosophical stance. And it's worth being precise about the distinction. Jake isn't avoiding responsibility in general. We've already spent an entire section establishing how seriously he takes his responsibilities as a father, a partner, a brother figure to Finn. What he's avoiding, specifically, is a particular kind of responsibility that requires becoming a fixed point other people orient themselves around.
Parenthood, partnership, brotherhood, all of it requires real, sustained commitment. But none of it requires Jake himself to become rigid, hierarchical, or singular in the way ruling a kingdom would. He's willing to commit deeply to relationships. He's simply never willing to commit to a role that would require him to stop being fundamentally, structurally flexible. There's a final observation worth resting on before we move to the next section, because it connects Jake's disinterest in power to something we discussed earlier about his alien, uncategorized origin. Nearly every character in this mythology who ends up holding significant power arrived at that position through some form of inheritance or cosmic assignment, a bloodline, a prophecy, an elemental cycle demanding a particular role be filled. Jake, arriving from entirely outside that architecture, was never assigned a role in the first place, which means his eventual disinterest in claiming one isn't really a refusal of anything specific. It's simply the natural extension of never having been handed a script in the first place. He gets to want what he actually wants, unconstrained by any inherited expectation about what a being of his particular nature is supposed to eventually become. And what he actually wants consistently across the entire run of the show turns out to be considerably smaller and considerably more sustainable than a throne. A family, a best friend, an ordinary life stretched quite literally into whatever shape each day happens to require. Section 14. Comfort as a legitimate value. Naps, snacks, and the case for rest. It's worth spending real time tonight on something this show treats with more genuine respect than almost any other piece of media aimed at a similar audience. Jake's open, unapologetic, entirely unashamed love of comfort. Naps, snacks, lounging, the specific sustained pleasure of doing absolutely nothing productive for a stretch of an ordinary afternoon. It's worth taking this seriously as a philosophical position, rather than dismissing it as simple laziness, because the show itself never treats it as something requiring correction or growth. Compare this to how comfort-seeking typically gets handled in stories aimed at young audiences more broadly. It's usually treated at best as a character flaw to be outgrown, the lazy character who eventually learns the value of hard work, the comfort-seeking character who eventually discovers that meaning comes from sacrifice and effort rather than rest. This show, through Jake specifically, refuses that entire framework. He remains, across the full 10 seasons, genuinely, unapologetically fond of comfort, and the show never once suggests this needs to change in order for him to be considered a fully realized, admirable character. He gets to be both genuinely brave, genuinely loyal, genuinely wise, and genuinely unashamedly someone who loves an afternoon nap. Those traits are never presented as being in tension with each other. It's worth asking what the specific refusal is actually arguing, underneath its comedic surface presentation. Most cultures, and most fiction produced within them, tend to treat rest as something that must be earned through prior productivity. You deserve the nap because you worked hard first. You're allowed the snack because you did something to justify it. Jake's relationship to comfort carries none of that conditional structure. He simply enjoys rest, directly, without treating it as a reward requiring prior justification. That's worth naming as a genuinely different value system than the one most stories, even good ones, tend to quietly reinforce. And it's worth crediting this show specifically for building an entire beloved character around modeling it consistently, rather than simply stating it once and moving on.
There's a theory worth floating about why this particular value pairs so naturally with everything else we've spent tonight establishing about Jake's broader philosophy. A being genuinely at peace with impermanence, genuinely unbothered by failure, genuinely uninterested in claiming power or status has, in a real sense, freed up an enormous amount of the psychological energy most people spend managing anxiety, striving, and self-justification. That freed energy has to go somewhere, and it's worth suggesting that Jake's specific, thorough enjoyment of ordinary comfort is exactly where it goes. He isn't simply lazy. He's someone whose entire relationship to fear, failure, and status has been resolved thoroughly enough that rest, for him, isn't something snatched guiltily between more important obligations. It's simply one more thing worth enjoying fully.
the same way he enjoys music or friendship or a well-timed joke. It's worth pairing this with a specific detail worth naming directly. Jake is never shown to be less effective, less capable, or less heroic as a direct result of his love of comfort. The show never sets up a scenario where his fondness for napping costs Finn or anyone else something significant, never uses his laziness as a plot device requiring correction. That absence matters, because it means the show isn't quietly punishing him for his values even while nominally celebrating them, the way some stories do. Praising a character's ease on the surface while structurally arranging events to prove that ease was actually a liability all along. This show simply lets Jake love rest, consistently, without cost, treating that love as one more legitimate, unremarkable piece of who he is, rather than a flaw requiring narrative punishment to teach him a lesson. There's a final thought worth resting on to close this section, because it's worth connecting this specific value directly to the format of tonight's video itself. A philosophy this genuinely comfortable with rest is, in its own way, the perfect philosophy to be exploring in a video explicitly built to help you fall asleep. Jake would have no complicated feelings about being used this way. He'd likely find it, if he could somehow know about it, entirely reasonable. Maybe even a little funny, in exactly the gentle, unbothered way he finds most things a little bit funny. Rest was never something he treated as needing an excuse. Let that be permission, if you need any, for wherever the rest of tonight takes you. Section 15. What Jake never learned to fix. The limits of his own philosophy. It's worth closing our exploration of Jake's specific worldview with something we've mostly avoided across the previous 14 sections. Honest acknowledgement of where his philosophy actually shows its limits. Because a genuinely thorough account of any way of living owes you its edges as much as its strength. And this show, to its credit, does occasionally let us see them. The clearest limit we've already touched on directly, his grief over his rapidly aging son. That storyline matters precisely because it's the one place across the entire show where Jake's usual ease genuinely, visibly fails to fully hold. He doesn't collapse entirely, and he doesn't abandon his broader philosophy of flexible acceptance, but he struggles, visibly, in a way he almost never struggles anywhere else, which is worth taking as real evidence that his equanimity was never actually unlimited. There was a specific kind of loss, watching a child's entire life compress into an unnaturally short span, that came close to genuinely testing the outer boundary of what his particular brand of ease could actually absorb. It's worth asking what else, beyond this one clear example, might sit outside the reach of Jake's usual flexibility, even if the show never directly dramatizes it. His relationship to his own alien, largely unexamined origin, which we spent an entire section establishing he seems genuinely unbothered by, is worth revisiting here with slightly more skepticism than we extended it the first time. It's possible his lack of curiosity about that origin really is evidence of genuine settled peace. It's also possible, and worth naming honestly, that some questions simply never got asked because asking them would have required confronting something his particular temperament wasn't actually built to hold. Not flexibility triumphing over difficulty, but a specific kind of difficulty quietly avoided rather than genuinely resolved. The show gives us no clear evidence to settle this question either way, and it's worth sitting with that ambiguity honestly rather than resolving it too neatly in Jake's favor simply because doing so fits the more comforting version of his character we spent most of tonight building. There's a further limit worth naming, this one structural rather than emotional. Jake's philosophy works remarkably well for himself and largely for the people directly around him, but the show never really tests whether it would scale to something larger. We spent an earlier section discussing his genuine disinterest in ruling anything, and while we framed that disinterest as a coherent extension of his broader values, it's worth adding the more skeptical read directly.
A philosophy built around flexibility, ease, and refusing rigid commitment might simply not be compatible with the kind of sustained structural responsibility that governing an actual kingdom requires. Bubblegum's own struggles, which we've traced in considerable detail across other deep dives, come specifically from trying to hold a position that demands exactly the kind of fixity Jake has built his entire life around avoiding. It's worth wondering whether Jake's ease is in part simply the ease available to someone who has arranged his life specifically to avoid ever being tested by the kind of pressure that role would require. Not proof that his philosophy would hold up under that pressure, but simply evidence that he was wise enough or fortunate enough to never have to find out.
It's worth adding one final, gentler limit before we close this section, because it's worth being honest about who specifically benefits most from Jake's particular brand of flexibility, and who might, in a slightly different configuration of this story, have been asked to absorb more of its cost. Jake's ease with letting people go, which we celebrated at real length in our section on fatherhood, functions beautifully when the people being let go are doing the leaving on reasonably healthy terms. It's worth wondering, honestly, whether that same ease would hold up as gracefully in a scenario the show never actually gives us, a child who left angry or hurt, or in a way that genuinely ruptured the relationship rather than simply outgrowing it naturally. We don't get to see Jake tested this way, and it's worth naming that absence directly rather than assuming his philosophy would automatically survive a test. The show is simply never interested in setting up for him. There's a final thought worth resting on to close this entire exploration, because it's the most honest way to hold everything we've spent tonight building. Jake's philosophy is genuinely admirable, genuinely worth learning from, genuinely rare in how consistently the show lets him embody it across 10 full seasons. It is also, almost certainly, incomplete, untested against certain specific kinds of pressure, possibly built in part on avoidances the show never asks us to examine too closely. That incompleteness doesn't undo anything we've covered across the previous 14 sections. It simply means Jake, like every genuinely useful philosophy anyone actually lives by rather than merely admires from a distance, was a specific, limited human, or dog, or whatever a being grown from an alien bite in the woods actually counts as, way of getting through a life, rather than a universal solution guaranteed to work for absolutely everyone in absolutely every circumstance without exception. That's not a criticism, it's simply the honest shape of what we've actually been examining tonight, and it's worth carrying that honesty forward as you drift toward whatever comes next. Section 16. The Songs Jake Sings. Creativity Without Ambition. It's worth spending real time tonight on something easy to file away as pure comic texture without noticing what it's actually doing. Jake's habit, scattered across the entire run of the show, of breaking into song, making up small instrumental melodies, or picking up an instrument to noodle around with, purely for his own amusement, with essentially no interest in whether anyone else is listening or whether the result is any good. This matters because it stands in genuine contrast to how creativity typically gets treated elsewhere in this mythology, and elsewhere in fiction more broadly. Marceline's music, which we've covered at length in previous deep dives, is deeply weighted, an entire emotional architecture built around processing centuries of grief through carefully crafted songs, each one meaningful, each one carrying real narrative freight. Jake's music carries none of that weight, and it's worth arguing that this absence of weight is itself the entire point. He isn't making art to process anything specific. He isn't performing for an audience whose approval he needs. He's simply making sounds because making sounds in that particular moment is enjoyable, and enjoyment alone is sufficient justification. It's worth naming directly how rare this specific relationship to creativity actually is, both in fiction and in how most people are culturally trained to think about their own creative impulses. Most stories that feature a character making art tend to frame that art making as either a path toward some external validation, recognition, success, an audience eventually won over, or as a vehicle for processing something difficult, the way Marceline's songs function. Jake's music does neither. It has no ambition attached to it at all. He isn't trying to get better at it, isn't tracking his own improvement, isn't hoping anyone in particular hears it and is moved by it. It exists entirely for the pleasure of the moment it's made in, and then it's simply over, unrecorded, unrepeated, gone the moment that produced it passes. There's a theory worth building here about what this specific relationship to creativity reveals about everything else we've spent this video establishing regarding Jake's broader worldview. A being this thoroughly at peace with impermanence, this genuinely uninterested in status or achievement, this comfortable treating comfort itself as a legitimate end rather than something requiring justification, would very naturally extend that same ease into how he makes art. Why would someone with nothing to prove need his songs to be good, or remembered, or shared? The absence of ambition in his creative life isn't a separate trait sitting alongside everything else we've covered tonight. It's the exact same underlying philosophy, simply expressed through a different medium. It's worth pairing this with a specific, quieter observation about what this teaches, by simple demonstration, about the actual relationship between creativity and pressure. A considerable amount of anxiety around creative work, in fiction and in life outside it, comes from treating the work as needing to justify itself, to be good enough, useful enough, meaningful enough to warrant the time spent making it. Jake's small, unambitious songs suggest an entirely different relationship is available. Creativity as simply one more way of being present in a moment, requiring no external justification, no measurable outcome, no audience by whoever happens to be nearby and willing to enjoy it alongside him. That's worth holding on to directly as one of the gentler, more genuinely useful pieces of wisdom this particular character offers, even though the show itself never frames it as wisdom at all. It's simply how he is, consistently, whenever a guitar or a moment of quiet happens to be within reach.
There's a final layer worth adding here, tying this specific quality back to the format of tonight's video directly, the way we did with his relationship to comfort a few sections earlier. This whole video, built to help you fall asleep rather than to deliver information with maximum efficiency, is doing something structurally similar to what Jake does with his songs, existing for the experience of the thing itself rather than purely for some measurable outcome at the other end of it. You don't need to remember every detail of what's been covered tonight for this time to have been worthwhile, the same way Jake's songs don't need to be remembered, recorded, or perfected in order to have been worth singing in the moment he sang them. It's worth closing this section with a small, quiet image worth carrying forward. Somewhere across this show's 10-season run, Jake picks up an instrument, plays something unremarkable and slightly off-key, and simply enjoys having played it, without a single thought about whether it was good. That's not a small example to end on. It might be one of the purest, most quietly radical things this entire mythology ever shows you. A genuinely talented, genuinely capable being, choosing, repeatedly, to make something purely because making it felt good, with absolutely no further justification required. Section 17. The choice at the beginning. Why Jake adopted Finn before anyone asked him to. We should close our exploration of Jake's philosophy by returning, one final time, to where his relationship with Finn actually began, because it's worth examining that origin directly, rather than assuming it simply happened the way most sibling relationships in fiction happen, through circumstance rather than genuine choice. The show's own account of how Finn came into Jake's family is handled with the same light, unemphasized touch this show extends to nearly everything Jake related. A human infant, found alone, taken in by Jake's own family without much narrative fanfare, folded into an already unusual household the same way Jake himself had been folded into it years earlier. It's worth noticing the clear symmetry there, directly. Jake, himself, accepted without hesitation into a family that had no real precedence for understanding what he was, grows up to become part of a family that extends that exact same unhesitating acceptance to a human child nobody had any obligation to take in at all. It's worth asking what it actually means that Jake specifically becomes the one most responsible for Finn's ongoing care, rather than this simply being framed as a shared family responsibility distributed evenly across Joshua and Margaret's household. The show consistently treats Jake's bond with Finn as something closer to chosen brotherhood than a signed obligation. He didn't simply happen to be present when Finn needed someone. He actively, consistently, across the entire span of the show, chose to remain the primary figure in Finn's life, long after any strict family obligation would have required it, well into Finn's own adulthood. There's a theory worth building here about why this specific choice, made this early and sustained this consistently, matters so much for understanding everything else we've covered across this video. Nearly every value we've traced tonight, the flexibility, the patience with failure, the ease with loss, the disinterest in power, the comfort with comfort itself, the unambitious joy in small creative acts, all of it gets demonstrated, primarily in the context of this one specific relationship. Jake's philosophy isn't simply a set of abstract values he happens to hold. It's a philosophy built, tested, and refined specifically through the ongoing, decades-long project of raising and accompanying one particular human boy, chosen freely, without any external requirement forcing that choice. It's worth sitting with what this means for how we should understand the entire video we've just spent this long constructing. We've spent 17 sections examining Jake's worldview as though it were a fully formed philosophy simply waiting to be described. It's worth acknowledging, honestly, that a considerable amount of that worldview may have actually been built specifically through the practice of loving and raising Finn. Not a philosophy Jake arrived with fully formed and then happened to apply to fatherhood, but a philosophy substantially shaped by the fatherhood itself, forged in the actual, sustained daily practice of choosing, over and over, across thousands of ordinary days, to keep showing up for someone he was never obligated to keep showing up for at all. There's a final thought worth resting on to close this section, and it reframes everything we've covered across this entire video in a way worth sitting with as we move toward the actual closing thoughts. Jake's ease with impermanence, his patience with failure, his comfort with letting go, none of it was ever free. It was purchased, slowly, across an entire life spent in the difficult, unglamorous, deeply worthwhile work of raising someone else's future. That he made it look easy, consistently, across 10 full seasons, was never evidence that it actually was easy. It was evidence of exactly how much practice, how much genuine choosing, and how much quiet, sustained love it actually takes to make something this difficult look like it isn't difficult at all. Section 18. What Jake never needed to believe in. Wonder without worship. It's worth closing our full exploration of Jake's philosophy with one last thread, because it ties together nearly everything we've covered across this entire video into a single, final observation about how he actually experiences the strange, magical, occasionally overwhelming world he lives in. This show's version of Ooo is, by any measure, a genuinely wondrous place. Kingdoms built from candy, ancient cosmic forces sleeping underneath ordinary landscapes, comets carrying opposing principles across geological time, an entire mythology this channel has spent many separate deep dives slowly excavating. Most characters who encounter that wonder directly tend to respond to it in one of two ways. Either they're awed by it, treating the strangeness of their world with something close to reverence, or they're eventually worn down by it, the strangeness becoming simply background noise they've stopped noticing at all. Jake, worth naming directly, does neither. He notices the strangeness of his world constantly, genuinely, with real interest and real delight, and yet he never once seems to worship any of it. Wonder, for him, never curdles into either awe or numbness. It simply stays exactly what it is, a source of ongoing, low-grade delight in an ordinary day that happens to also contain magic. It's worth sitting with how genuinely rare this specific relationship to wonder actually is, both within this show's own cast and in fiction more broadly. Characters who encounter genuine magic tend to be changed by the encounter in some lasting, dramatic way. Humbled, transformed, occasionally destabilized by contact with something larger than their previous understanding of reality could accommodate. Jake meets magic, cosmic threats, and ancient mysteries with roughly the same casual interest he brings to a new flavor of ice cream. That's not indifference. We've established across this entire video that Jake is capable of genuine depth, genuine feeling, genuine investment in what matters to him. It's something more specific, an unwillingness to let wonder become weight. He can be delighted by something strange without needing that delight to reorganize his entire understanding of the world around it. There's a theory worth building here about why this particular quality might be the culmination of everything else we spent this video tracing. A being this thoroughly at peace with impermanence, this genuinely unbothered by failure, this uninterested in power, this comfortable with rest, this unambitious about his own creative expression, would very naturally extend that same lightness into how he encounters wonder itself. Awe, in its more intense forms, often requires a kind of self-diminishment, the sense of being small before something vast. Jake never seems to experience that particular diminishment, not because he's arrogant or unable to recognize scale, but because his entire worldview, built across everything we've covered tonight, simply doesn't organize itself around comparing his own size to the size of whatever he happens to be looking at. He's not measuring himself against the cosmic, he's simply enjoying it, the way he enjoys nearly everything else, without needing it to mean anything larger than the specific, immediate pleasure of encountering it. It's worth pairing this with a specific, quieter observation about what this teaches by demonstration about the actual relationship between wonder and worship, two things frequently treated as inseparable in how stories usually handle magic and mystery. Worship requires a kind of permanent subordination, the worshipper positioned beneath the thing worshipped, indefinitely, without much room for equal footing. Wonder, in its purer form, doesn't actually require that subordination at all. You can be delighted by something considerably larger than yourself without needing to kneel before it, without needing the encounter to become a permanent feature of your identity, without needing the strangeness to cost you your own footing in the ordinary, particular life you were already living. Jake models that distinction more consistently than almost any other character in this entire mythology, and it's worth crediting the show directly for building an entire character around demonstrating it rather than simply stating it as an abstract idea somewhere in a single episode and moving on. There's a final layer worth adding here, tying this specific quality directly back to the cosmic scale we've spent so much time exploring across other deep dives on this channel. We've traced in previous videos beings who carry the actual weight of that cosmic scale directly, ancient convictions held for 65 million years, entities that predate the universe itself, patient forces whose scale dwarfs anything an ordinary character could comfortably hold in mind. Jake exists in the exact same universe as all of that. He's occasionally, directly, in contact with pieces of it, and he simply never lets any of it become the organizing principle of his own life. That's worth naming as its own genuinely remarkable achievement, considerably rarer than it initially sounds. Most beings who brush up against something that vast come away changed by the encounter, reoriented around the new, larger scale they've just been shown. Jake brushes up against it, repeatedly, across an entire decade of episodes, and simply goes back to making a sandwich, delighted by what he just witnessed, unchanged in any of the ways that would actually matter to how he continues living his own, considerably smaller, considerably more particular life. It's worth closing this final section and this entire exploration of who Jake actually is with a single quiet image worth carrying all the way through to the end of tonight's video. Somewhere in this show, Jake encounters something genuinely cosmic, vast, ancient, considerably larger than anything his ordinary life would normally contain, and his response, after the initial delight passes, is simply to keep doing whatever he was doing before it interrupted him. Not dismissively, not because he failed to appreciate the scale of what he'd just witnessed, simply because his own life, however small it looked next to whatever cosmic thing had just passed through it, was never actually diminished by the comparison. That might be the single most useful thing this entire 18-section exploration has managed to uncover, that it's genuinely possible to be delighted by the vastness of everything surrounding you, take real, honest pleasure in its strangeness, and still, afterward, simply go back to your own particular, ordinary, entirely sufficient life, without needing the vastness to have changed the single thing about how worthwhile that life already was. Section 19. The Ordinary Nights, a final, smaller thought before we let this go. It's worth spending a little more time before we move into the actual closing thoughts on something we've touched at the edges of throughout tonight's video but never quite sat with directly. What an ordinary night actually looked like for Jake across the hundreds of them the show never bothers showing us, tucked in the gaps between the adventures we actually got to watch. Most of what we know about him comes from the eventful stretches, the crises, the confrontations, the moments significant enough to build an episode around. It's worth imagining, deliberately, the considerably larger number of nights that weren't like that at all. Ordinary evenings in the treehouse, a meal eaten without incident, a song hummed to no one in particular while he drifted toward sleep, the same unambitious kind of song we spent an entire section discussing earlier tonight. Those nights make up the overwhelming majority of his actual life, even though the show, by narrative necessity, could only ever show us the exceptions.
It's worth taking that imbalance seriously as its own kind of quiet lesson. We've spent 18 sections examining Jake through the lens of what the show chose to dramatize: his bravery under pressure, his grief over his rapidly aging son, his confrontations with cosmic scale. All of that is real, and all of it matters. But it's worth remembering that the actual bulk of any life, including a fictional one built mostly from highlight reels, is made of the ordinary nights nobody bothers filming. Jake's philosophy wasn't built primarily in the dramatic moments. It was built mostly in exactly the kind of unremarkable evening you might be having right now, listening to this. Nothing urgent happening, no crisis requiring resolution, simply an ordinary stretch of time passing quietly towards sleep. There's a gentle thought worth resting on here, because it's the truest possible bridge between everything we've spent tonight examining and whatever the rest of your own evening actually looks like. If Jake's entire remarkable ease was built primarily out of thousands of unremarkable, undramatized nights just like this one, then whatever ordinary night you're currently in the middle of is, in its own small way, doing exactly the same kind of quiet, cumulative work. You don't need tonight to be significant. You don't need this particular evening to resolve anything, teach you anything, or leave you meaningfully changed by morning. It can simply be one more ordinary night, unremarkable, uneventful, the kind that never makes it into anyone's highlight reel. And it can still, in its own small way, be exactly the kind of night a whole life's worth of ease eventually gets built out of. It's worth closing this final section with the smallest possible image, because after 18 sections of tracing an entire philosophy across an entire mythology, the smallest image is probably the truest place to actually land. Somewhere, in a version of this world nobody ever got to see on screen, Jake is simply lying still, comfortable, unbothered, letting an ordinary night pass the way ordinary nights are supposed to pass. Nothing urgent, nothing requiring resolution, just rest, taken fully, without needing to earn it first. That's the whole philosophy, distilled down to its smallest possible size. Wherever you are right now, whatever kind of night this has been for you, you're allowed exactly that same small, unremarkable, entirely sufficient thing. That's the whole shape of it, a philosophy built almost entirely out of ease, generosity, and a genuinely rare willingness to hold nearly everything loosely enough that losing it never quite breaks the person doing the holding. We started with a stretchy body used almost exclusively for small domestic kindness rather than dramatic advantage, and traced that same underlying quality through a strange, unglamorous origin met with unconditional acceptance, through a philosophy of failure that refuses to treat early incompetence as a verdict on anyone's worth, through a communication style that delivers its deepest truths with the same casual ease as its jokes, through a brotherhood built on trust rather than hierarchy, through a love story built on doing the real, unglamorous work of crossing genuine difference, through a fatherhood that welcomed multiplicity and let go without resentment, through an alien inheritance carried without anxiety, through an elasticity that bends without breaking most of the time for as long as we got to watch, through a fear redirected entirely toward the people worth being afraid for, through a genuine disinterest in power that turned out to be the natural extension of never wanting to hold anything too rigidly in the first place, through an unashamed, unconditional love of rest, through songs made purely for the pleasure of making them,
through a choice made freely and sustained for decades to raise someone he was never obligated to raise, through a relationship to wonder that never once curdled into either worship or numbness, and finally, through a quiet, largely undramatized ending that seems, in everything we can infer about who he was, to have been met with the same ease he brought to everything else. It's worth taking one last, slow pass back across the full shape of that list before we let it go completely. Because 18 sections is a great deal to have carried through a single night, and it's worth honoring the sheer accumulated weight of it by naming it plainly, one final time before we close. A dog, grown from a strange wound in some unnamed woods, accepted immediately and completely by a family with no reason to understand what he was, who grew up to spend an entire life demonstrating, patiently and without ever once demanding recognition for it, what it actually looks like to hold a life loosely enough that nothing about its impermanence ever needed to become a crisis. That's not a small thing to have spent this many hours examining. It might honestly be one of the more genuinely useful pieces of wisdom this entire mythology ever offers, precisely because it never once announced itself as wisdom in the first place. None of this required Jake to be the show's official protagonist. He simply had to be present, consistently, patiently, for the entire run of the series, demonstrating a way of living that the show's actual hero would spend 10 seasons slowly, painfully learning to approach. That's worth sitting with tonight, as you let the rest of this video carry you towards sleep. Sometimes the person doing the most important work in a story isn't the one the story is technically about. Sometimes they're simply the one standing quietly nearby, stretching into whatever shape the moment needs, waiting patiently for everyone else to eventually catch up. There's a final thought worth resting on before we let this video go completely, because it's the gentlest possible way to close something built specifically to be fallen asleep to. You don't need to remember 18 sections we walked through tonight. You don't need to hold on to every specific argument, every small piece of evidence, every carefully traced thread connecting one section to the next. If even a single piece of it stays with you tomorrow, the image of a stretchy body used for small kindnesses, the patience with early failure, the unashamed love of an afternoon nap, the wonder that never needed to become worship, that's enough. Jake himself never needed his songs to be remembered in order for them to have been worth singing. This video doesn't need to be remembered perfectly either in order to have been worth the time you spent letting it carry you towards sleep tonight. If any of tonight's ideas stayed with you, or if there's a piece of this mythology you'd want a future video to sit with the same way, leave a comment and let me know. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. I read every one of these, and it means something, knowing who's still here this deep into a video this long. Subscribe if you haven't yet,